First story. In the late 1950s, three teenage boys went into the Sierra foothills in California, which is what you see over there on your left, in California, and they were going gold panning and exploring. And they ran across a hole in the ground that turned out to be a cave. But there was a big drop off right at the entrance and they needed a rope so they could get down into the cave. So next time they came up there, they brought a rope and lowered themselves into the cave. They didn't think about the fact that if someone decided to come along and take that rope, they were done for. There was no way to get back out of the cave without a rope, and they had no food or water. So it's pretty doubtful they would have survived if somebody had taken that rope. So why am I telling you this story? Well, to establish my bona fides as a person who does dumb things. Yes, I was one of those teenagers. So why were we so reckless? Well, maybe it's because we all had an immature frontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is not fully mature until about age 25. And as a result, teenagers don't always make the best decisions. Perhaps you've observed that phenomenon. Now, I'm not picking on teenagers here, but interesting. Professor Sapolsky, the citation you see down at the bottom, he talked about the prefrontal cortex in his book in great detail, in his book Behave. And he described a different cave in the same area of California with a 180-foot drop where they found several skeletons at the bottom, all teenagers. So we do have a pattern here. Our cave was only about a 30-foot drop, so I know it's not the same cave, but the parallels are there. Greetings, my name is Science-Hansten, and today we will discuss human fallibility, a defining feature of the human condition. I've been interested in this topic for a long time, partly from self-observation. Some of my ideas and actions have led me eventually to say, what was I thinking? And partly from watching others. For example, over the years, I've seen many people say inaccurate things about drug-drug interactions. This is my field of study. And the statements were usually made by people who were experts in some other field, not in drug interactions. So let's first look at this topic from a broad perspective. There's a general term for what we're dealing with: stupidity. We're basically just a bunch of monkeys running around on a rock, and it doesn't matter how smart you are, even if you have lots of mental horsepower. A Ferrari can be driven well or poorly, and you can actually get into more trouble at 100 miles an hour than if you're driving a clunker that's putting along at about half that speed. So being smart doesn't cause you to avoid this. So first we address the problem of stupidity. Stupidity has created countless human disasters over the years, and the present time is no exception. And for the first time in history, our stupidity can affect everyone on the planet. I suppose this started in the early 20th century, but it clearly is worse now. We can't eliminate stupidity, even from ourselves. But we'll learn later from French writer Michel de Montaigne that there are some ways of dealing with it that are better than others. And by the way, Montaigne's 500th birthday is coming up in about 8 years. Very exciting. The ancient Greeks talked about a form of stupidity. Plato's philodoxers were concerned about appearances rather than what is actually the case. And I'm sure that our cave-dwelling ancestors of 20,000 years ago talked about it too. I mean, like when Zog put his finger in the fire again, I'm sure they had a name for it. And countless thinkers over the years have piled on. German polymath Friedrich said, "Against stupidity, the gods themselves labor in vain." Einstein said, "Only two things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity, and I'm not sure about the universe." By the way, usually I use a more dignified photo of Einstein, but since he's being funny, I use this photo, but just for this slide. The brilliant Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari said, "If we humans are so smart, why do we do so many stupid things?" And again, we're not talking about IQ, whatever that means. Smart people do stupid things all the time, and they can actually be more dangerous because they sound like they know what they're talking about. Now, Yuval Noah Harari talks about this issue in depth in his latest book, Nexus, which I'm currently reading and enjoying very much. But you don't have to look far for evidence of people doing stupid things. Lots of guys on ladders on the internet. I have several more, but I'll spare you. Ladders are dangerous under any circumstances. But look at that guy on the left. There's some benches and then a table on top of the benches and then two concrete blocks on the top of the table and then his ladder. Amazing. This is a Darwin Award in the making. And it's always guys, by the way. I hate to say that, but it sure seems like women are less likely to do stupid physical things, at least. Sometimes it's groups of guys with too much time on their hands. I suspect alcohol was involved in this little stunt. But these examples would only affect a few people. As Harari notes, one of the most powerful forces in history, actually, is human stupidity. So it can be very dangerous when large groups of people do stupid things together in concert. And unfortunately, that happens a lot. And it's happening now. History is littered with large groups of people doing stupid things. And if we're only stupid, it would not be a problem. It's the combination of stupidity with our amazing technical abilities. So we have powerful technology combined with a lack of wisdom, which is a really toxic brew. So Harari says, we're smart enough to make many things like computers, nuclear fission, plastics, cars, corn syrup, pesticides, life-saving medicines, but we're not smart enough to use them safely. And regarding life-saving medicines, the last 3 scientific papers I published in the last couple of years, every one of them was about patients being harmed when health professionals fail to manage their drug-drug interactions properly. And by the way, these are situations where we have enough information to prevent these adverse outcomes. So it's not a matter of lack of information. Okay, this is heavy stuff, so let's look at another example of stupidity. What's wrong with this picture? Give up? Well, the yellow truck paints their trucks orange. One would think they would know better than to have a yellow caution sign nearby. You can see in the lower right there. That's yellow. The yellow truck sign at the top is orange. Now, they went out of business a couple of years ago, which I'm sorry about, but what did they expect? I've been using this example for decades, but then a few years ago I saw this yellow logo on a yellow truck, and I was rejoicing until I looked at the back of the truck. I was crestfallen. The logo was a deep, deep orange. So I got my hopes up too quickly. Okay, so don't forget, we are called Homo sapiens, wise humans, but it's kind of a misnomer. Our lack of wisdom is our most glaring flaw. Our human stupidity plays a key role in most of our human disasters, including our current existential threats like climate change, nuclear annihilation, and out-of-control artificial intelligence. Now, it's true that if humanity gets wiped out by a giant asteroid, we can't blame that on stupidity, but that's the exception. These other things are a lot more likely. So there's a lot of ways to be stupid, but there's one way I would argue rises above all the others. And it is the ignorance of certainty. I actually wrote a book about this. I forgot to get it out. Here it is. Here's my version, which is all premature factualization, the ignorance of certainty, and the ghost of Montaigne, which I wrote a couple decades, 15 years ago. And yes, I made up the word factualization. That's a neologism. And I'm not hawking the book. It's out of print, so you can't buy it. I might do a second edition if I finish some of my other projects. So the ignorance of certainty is everywhere. Philosopher Karl Popper talked about this. Dogma can become so strongly entrenched that it resembles the imprinting of newborn animals. When a gosling imprints on an animal other than its mother, nothing will convince it that it has made a mistake. So intransigent dogma has always been a problem, but I would argue that it's actually way worse now, or at least worse than it was 50 years ago. I could be wrong, but it sure seems like it's getting worse. And by the way, Popper is talking about any dogma, scientific, political, racist, any dogmatic intransigence that we have. James Carse weighed in on this. As soon as a person becomes committed to a belief, not just an opinion, but a deeply held belief, thinking basically stops. Now, James Carse was a professor emeritus at NYU, and he wrote some very interesting books. Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, 20th century British philosopher, said, "The whole problem of the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wiser people so full of doubts." It's a great quote, and he nails the problem of ignorance of certainty. I've seen this quote everywhere. I wish I had $1,000 for every time I've seen this quote. By the way, why do people always say, "I wish I had a nickel for every time something happened"? You're just wishing. You can set the amount whatever you want. So I want $1,000 for every time I've seen this quote. But actually, nobody can find this quote anywhere in his writings. He almost certainly didn't say it. Somebody else came up with it afterwards, paraphrasing him. What he did say was, the fundamental cause of the trouble is that in the modern world, the stupid are cocksure, while the intelligent are full of doubt. So it's the same concept. I actually like the false version a little better, but it's the same concept, and he describes the sentiment of ignorance of certainty. Nietzsche talked about this a lot. What Nietzsche means by mental sloth is that almost everyone comes to conclusions, even convictions, without even a cursory examination of the basis for their conclusions. For example, in The Gay Science, right at the beginning, he says he talks about the intellectual conscience, and he says, "I keep having the same experience and keep resisting it every time. I do not want to believe it, although it is palpable. The great majority of people lacks an intellectual conscience. In such people, the desire for certainty is their inmost craving and deepest distress." Now, he talks about this issue a lot throughout his books, people's deeply held but poorly conceived convictions causing a lot of mischief in the world. If he thought it was bad in his day, he should see what it's like when large segments of the population are being fed garbage on a regular basis. And again, it's not just in the US, it's a worldwide problem. You'll be hearing a lot from Nietzsche in these lectures, so in case some of you have formed opinions about Nietzsche without having read him, which is almost everyone, even many philosophers and intellectuals haven't read Nietzsche. This is my Nietzsche library. I have read all of those, and also 6 or 8 more that are on my computer as PDFs or in Kindle, some sort of e-publication. And I have to tell you, it took a long time. I've been working on this for 35 years to read and reread some of these. The one that you see, you probably can't see my pointer, but the one that is second from the right, there's the light blue one, and the next one that says Friedrich at the top. That's The Gay Science, and I took that on a trip once to La Paz in Mexico, and I had a month. And I worked. It wasn't work. It was fun. But I read that book several hours a day, almost every day, and I still didn't get through the book because with Nietzsche, you read one of his aphorisms, and typically, if you're really reading it correctly, you stop and think about it for another 10 or 15 minutes. So it can be it can take a long time to get through one of his books. Nietzsche is my favorite philosopher, along with Montaigne. Harold Bloom was a humanities professor. He said, "The dawn of day has brought us the information age. Where shall wisdom be found?" My own answer would be in Shakespeare, Goethe, Emerson, Nietzsche, and their few peers. Curtis Cate, he had degrees from Harvard and Oxford. He was the European editor for The Atlantic, and he wrote a book on Nietzsche. It came out in 2006. And he said Friedrich Nietzsche was the most fearlessly provocative and original thinker in Western history. That's a pretty bold statement, kind of like Nietzsche. So now you see why I've spent so much time reading Nietzsche. I have lots of other statements like that I'll spare you, but Okay, so what are we talking about with the ignorance of certainty? Well, this is what we think we know in blue here, and this is what we actually know in green, which is only a small subset of what we think we know. Also, what we actually know in green doesn't mean truth with a capital T. It means ideas that are probable, sometimes very probable. But as Nietzsche said correctly, there are no facts, only probabilities. So, what I would propose is that we call this difference between what we think we know and what we actually know the stupidity quotient. In other words, the SQ as opposed to the IQ, whatever that means. And the irony is that people with high IQs often also have a very high SQ. So stupidity is actually not a simple concept. It's not just a matter of not knowing stuff. That's what people normally think of when they think of stupidity. Well, it's just people that don't know very much. It's actually the disparity between what we think we know in blue and what we actually know in green. The problem is not that we're here. The problem is that we think we are here. This reminds me of the quote attributed to Mark Twain. I'm very hesitant about quotes, but anyway, it's been attributed to him. Quote, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so." So the stupidity quotient is filled with a toxic stew of destructive fallacies and impulses, bunk, fantasy, delusion, half-truths, certitude, wishful thinking, mental sloth, etc., etc. Excuse me. Whoops. Sure, we may have some genuine knowledge, but it's mixed in with the other stuff, so it all feels the same to us. This is an important point. Genuine knowledge and BS are all mixed together, and they're indistinguishable to the individual who harbors these ideas. And that's what makes it so hard to root them out, because if we could tell the difference, then we would eliminate the ones that aren't true. Now, most of us have a pretty high stupidity quotient. I'm sure I do. But I have been working very hard to reduce it, based mainly on philosophy and philosophical readings. But let's say that on average people have a stupidity quotient of 80. Well, here's the good news. We can cut our stupidity quotient in half without learning a single thing. Just stop believing in so much BS. And Montaigne probably understood this better than anyone. It is Michel de Montaigne who had perhaps the lowest stupidity quotient in human history. I'm going to propose that. Nobody would be able to counter that, probably. It's even possible that he had the only negative stupidity quotient in history. His mantra was, "What do I know?" And his book, which I should also grab for you so you can see it. Sorry about that. Is definitely worth reading. This one takes quite a while. It's 1,100 pages, more or less. As you can see, I've made quite a few little notes. I've started putting this on my computer so I don't have to try to find the actual quotes from my copy. But reading his essays can truly help with reducing one's stupidity quotient. For me, I have a pre-Montaigne mindset and a post-Montaigne mindset. And the post-Montaigne mindset is vastly preferable in my view. So don't forget, it doesn't matter how much you know if you also fill your head with many ideas that are false or improbable. Try to emulate Michel de Montaigne's intellectual humility. It's really hard to overestimate the magnitude of the impact of Montaigne, including some of the greatest thinkers in history. Basically, every French thinker, you can see them over there on the left, but also Shakespeare, Emerson, T.S. Eliot, Nietzsche loved him, Camus did, et cetera, et cetera. I had to stop adding to this slide because I ran out of room. I could probably put another group of 20 or 30 names on another slide. Was able to visit his chateau, which was a high point. It's about 60 kilometers east of Bordeaux in western France. And I took this photo from his tower, which you'll see on the next slide. I couldn't get around that tree. It was blocking from wherever I tried to take the photo. This was built in the 14th century, but it burned, so this is a replica. His library was on the top floor, and this is the original tower. It still stands. It's the actual place where he wrote almost 500 years ago. To stand there was just amazing in that room. Do you think the building where you sit now will be there in 500 years? Probably for most of us, the answer is no. And again, I include myself as one who has done many dumb things. There's a long list. I have a clipboard, but my wife actually has a book, and it's a rather thick book, and this is volume 4. So that tells you how many dumb things I've done in my life. And she doesn't even know about all the dumb things I did before I met her. I'm trying to keep that quiet. Now, we've been talking about the ignorance of certainty, but is absolute certainty even theoretically possible? And there's a lot of question. Probably not, actually. The ancient Greeks discussed this a lot, and nothing has changed. We have some extraordinarily good guesses now, especially in the sciences, but they're still guesses. As for certain truth, no man has known it, nor shall he know it, neither of the gods, nor yet of all the things of which I speak. For even if by chance he were to utter the final truth, he would himself not know it, for all is but a woven web of guesses. So, Polish philosophy professor Kolakowski, I won't try to pronounce his first name, he said, the very concept of truth makes it impossible to say there is no truth, for this would mean it is true that nothing is true. This is one of those cases where I think it is reasonable to go into this kind of parsing and logic chopping, because it makes sense. But what about certainty with logic? Well, that could be a different story. Logical deductions and descriptive statements can be essentially certain. All humans are mortal. Killian is human. Killian is mortal. Now, how did I come up with Killian as an example? Well, I Googled the best football player in the world, and his name came up several times. He's a French player. But I watched some of his videos and some of his goals, and one that made me question the last statement of this, all humans are mortal, Killian is human, Killian is mortal. They were truly amazing. And by football, of course, I mean what most of the world means by football here. So, yes, with logic, it's based on our definitions, but it's pretty trivial. That, logic doesn't get us very far when we're dealing with, it gets us part of the way, but when we're dealing with complex issues where we're trying to come to a conclusion. And I won't get into the philosophy of mathematics, or in this case, arithmetic, but yeah, nobody doubts that 2 + 3 = 5. So yeah, there are some trivial things where certainty may be possible. But when we get into concepts and more complex issues, such as scientific statements, certainty is a lot harder to come by. Pyrrho said, every proof derives from premises that it did not itself establish, which leads to an infinite regress. Summarizing Greek skepticism, Brian McGee, who's was a British philosopher, said, certainty is simply not available at the level of argument, demonstration, or proof. Now, of course, the most famous person who was trying to get at certainty is René Descartes. He did believe in certainty because he came up with this, as I'm sure you've all heard, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. This is one of the most famous statements in philosophy. And it has generated a lot of cartoons. I'll only show you one, but there are 10 or 15 on this same theme that you'll see on the next one. There's some guy having a crisis. He says, I think, therefore I am, or am I? And the flight attendant says, is there a doctor of philosophy on board? And that's the guy with the blue shirt in front of him, I'm sure. He looks like it. But for some reason, cartoonists have found that concept a funny thing to make cartoons about. And there's a lot of other stuff on Descartes. This is Descartes when he finds out that people who don't think also exist. He's rather surprised to hear that. This was actually pretty good. So Bertrand Russell again, not to be absolutely certain is, I think, one of the essential things in rationality. And I would agree with him. But he also points out that one admits that nothing is certain. One must, I think, also admit that some things are much more nearly certain than others. Russell was a very practical philosopher, and a lot of his stuff is really interesting from that standpoint. So don't forget, absolute certainty is not available to us, but there are many situations where the probability is high enough so that we can assume it's true and act accordingly. Okay, let's talk about other kinds of stupidity. Ultra-crepidarianism. Before we do this, let me just point out that the books you see, there's Nietzsche doll there, and then all those books there are all about Nietzsche or by Nietzsche. I put him on the top shelf, of course. I mean, that's where he deserves to be. Okay. Now, ultra-crepidarianism is a great word, and it's also a very useful word. When a word substitutes for an entire sentence, I think it's acceptable to use it. If it's just a word that says the same thing that a simpler word says, probably not. But in this case, I think it's okay. Ultra-crepidarian is a person who expresses opinions on matters outside the scope of their knowledge or expertise. I'm sure you've noticed there's a lot of this going around these days. Including, unfortunately, sometimes when you look in the mirror. Montaigne talked about those who had strong opinions after only, quote, tasting the outer crust of a topic. And he was talking about ultra-crepidarians. Now, we're currently in an ultra-crepidarian apocalypse. Forget the zombie apocalypse. Ultra-crepidarians are way more dangerous and way more numerous. Now, sometimes it's harmless, like, or at least theoretically harmless, like when I mansplain when my wife is cooking, even though I can barely boil water. I should know better since she has all those knives and pans that she could use on me, but it can be more sinister, such as self-taught virologists who know everything about COVID and vaccines, self-taught climatologists who know more than all those scientists with their fancy degrees, and self-taught neuroscientists who can explain for us exactly why people act in the way they do. And these self-taught neuroscientists claim that they can make that knife-edge decision that defendant A deserves execution and defendant B deserves only life in prison. And that's patently absurd. Nobody can make that kind of a decision. Nobody has the information. We're not that smart. So we need an ultra-crepidarian free zone in order to have useful dialogue. And of course, Montaigne is the cure. If it's a subject I do not understand at all, I essay my judgment, sounding the ford from a good distance, and then finding it too deep for my height, I stick to the bank. So he's talking exactly about ultra-crepidarians. We need more people to stick to the bank. Now, and once you've read Montaigne, you can't outdo it. He sits on my shoulder and whispering or yelling this in my ear. Remember, Phil, you might be wrong. Montaigne is the one-man antimatter to dogmatism. I still fall prey to dogmatism, of course, but I think I do it a lot less than before I read Montaigne. This is Immanuel Kant. Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. This is basically fallibilism. And many other important thinkers in the past have talked about human fallibility. By the way, you see these trees. This is the forest where Home Depot sources their 2x4s. You probably wondered why they were all so crooked. Now, some of you may be thinking about the Dunning-Kruger effect and how it is related. And there's a close relationship. People start out thinking they know everything, which is at point A up there on the left, upper left, but they don't know enough to know what they don't know. And if they start to learn, they get to point B and they say, wow, this is very complicated. But first of all, not many people go take that next step, and they still think they know more than the experts at that point. At point C, it may seem hopeless. Very few people get this far, and they often quit when they get this far. I mean, that's not many people have the perseverance to keep going at that point. The expert, on the other hand, reaches point D, where she knows the limitations of the field and the pros and cons to the various theories. But 99% of people fall into A, B, or C, and the experts have difficulty getting a word in edgewise oftentimes. So that's a tough problem. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is when you don't know enough to know what you don't know. Now, there was a recent paper from a mathematician who questioned the Dunning-Kruger effect, whether the statistics were handled correctly, but I think most people feel that by and large it's an actual phenomenon. Okay, another example of human stupidity. A duct tape banana sold for $6.2 million at an art auction. Actually, I hesitate to use this example because I may be admitting that I'm a Philistine regarding art. Maybe that actually is worth 6.2 million. Now, a chimp, if you told the chimp this story, he might think it was a good deal until you told him that the person who bought this banana and duct tape could probably get 20 million bananas for 6.2 million instead of one banana with duct tape. So he would probably think that you were pretty stupid to only get one. Okay, now let's discuss levels of understanding. It's much more nuanced than just right or wrong. Here's a figure I constructed that was in that book I showed you earlier, Premature Factulation, to depict our levels of understanding. Error to the left of the line and truth to the right. I have truth in quotes because we're talking about probabilities, not incontrovertible truths. So depending on the topic, we might be in any one of those first four categories. We might be misinformed, we might be poorly informed, we might be well informed, and for a few select topics, we might be a true expert. It's hard to be a true expert in more than one topic, but it's possible. And of course, there are intermediate points between all of these. So think of this as a continuum. I mean, you can be between poorly informed and well informed. There's obviously countless points in between. So think of this as a continuum, even though you see it as just bars. So when you're discussing something, it's important to realistically assess where you are on this continuum. If you're misinformed about some public policy, but you think you are well informed, you can do a lot of mischief, especially if you have the power to make public policy decisions. So when you're misinformed, we have far more error than truth here. This has become a worldwide epidemic. As I said a couple times already, it's not just the U.S. Social media can spread lies at lightning speed, and the algorithms have learned to give you the stuff that makes you outraged, which generates more money for them. This is artificial intelligence run amok. Now, we've always had misinformation. Back in my day, Cletus would ride up on his horse and tell you the false rumor that, did you hear that Butcher Bob ran off with the schoolmarm? But most people in other parts of the state wouldn't know about it. Now, misinformation can reach millions of people very quickly. Mark Twain talked about this too. A lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth puts on its shoes. You should see what it's like now. And Twain gets credit for this always, but ironically, it appears that he didn't say it. Nobody can find him saying this anywhere. Jonathan Swift said something similar, but we're not sure if that's where it came from. So spreading lies is nothing new. We humans have known that, but now lies can infect a large proportion of the population. These days, a guy on his computer in his basement can start a lie that will become viral. And if you're famous with millions of followers, the lies can be believed by a large portion of the population. The problem with this category is that by definition, you don't know you are there. It's kind of like this. When you're dead, you don't know you're dead. The pain is only felt by others. The same thing happens when you're stupid. So when you're misinformed, by definition, you don't know it. So when I recently tried to think of a personal example to use, I couldn't do it because if I knew I was misinformed about a topic, I wouldn't be misinformed. If you think about that. But I think we can all remember things we once believed in the past that turned out not to be true. So you can use that for an example. Here, with poorly informed, you just don't know much about a topic. This is where I am on countless issues. And this isn't so bad as long as you know you are poorly informed and you don't have much of the bar on the error side. If you know you're poorly informed, then you're not going to try to convince other people of your position. Now we go to well-informed. I'm well-informed about some philosophers like Nietzsche, Montaigne, Blaise Pascal, Epicurus, the Stoics, and a few others, but I'm not a true expert. I'm not a Nietzsche scholar who writes scholarly articles about Nietzsche. I read those articles, but I don't generate them. So I don't get past being just well-informed on some of those topics. There are true experts in almost every scientific field, and for that matter, almost every other field, whether you're an arborist or a historian or an electrician. Now, most of us in the sciences and other scholarly fields have had to substantially narrow our scope over time. It's just too difficult to cover an entire topic. When I started studying drug-drug interactions almost 60 years ago, one could be a true expert in a whole field, but now I focus on a very small subset of drug-drug interactions. Now, the light purple there is what we don't know in science, but at least theoretically we may know at some point. There's a huge amount we don't know. Look at neuroscience, for example. And I probably should have made this light purple part several times longer, but it wouldn't fit on the slide. Finally, there's the unknowable. Some people don't believe in the unknowable, but I think that's an opinion coming from their hubris. There are two types of unknowable, in my view. Unknowable in principle, such as I'm told by physicists, I don't know anything about this, but I'm told that you can't figure out the location and speed of an electron at the same time. So let's assume that they're not lying to me about that. But there's also unknowable due to the inherent limitations of the human brain, and this is the one I want to focus on because this is the one that affects us in our daily lives. Now, that photo is from the Webb telescope, and so this brings up the first category there. Are there things in astrophysics that are unknowable in principle, like maybe the conditions inside a black hole? Now, we have astrophysics professor John Wardle, who will be giving a lecture in this series a little later, so we can ask him that. But at least I think most people would agree there are these two types. So the second type, I'd like to talk about that second type, inherent limitations of the human brain. Here's the perpetrator, Periscope. So we'll focus on the feline brain here. She was pretty smart, as cats go. And here's the victim, the dog next door, Rocky. So our cat was an indoor-outdoor cat, and every time she went outside, the dog attacked her immediately. She had to run for her life. Then our neighbor put an invisible fence to keep Rocky in the yard with the little white flags to show Rocky where he had to stop. The cat figured out very quickly that Rocky couldn't go past the white flags, and taunting ensued. It was just terrible. We felt guilty. She would go out just outside of those white flags and sit there and lick herself and walk slowly back and forth. Rocky is having apoplexy over on the other side, barking and slobbering and running around. Now, here's the question. If we had tried to explain to the cat about electric currents and radio waves, etc., she wouldn't understand a word. She understood some food words, shrimp, for example, but she wouldn't have understood a word that we talked when we were talking about that kind of thing. This was unknowable to her. There were limits to her understanding. So my question to you is, what makes us think as humans that we're the only animals with no limitations on what we can ever understand? This sounds like rampant anthropocentrism to me. And I think that, I can't prove it, of course, but I think that it is extremely likely that there are limits to what we as humans are that it's even possible for us to understand because of the limitations of our brains. The cat had limitations. I think that we can safely assume that we do too. The amazing J.B.S. Haldane talked about this. He said, the universe is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine. And there are various versions of this quote, but it's usually rendered like this. He's talking about the unknowable, exactly what I've been talking about. He's talking about the unknowable based on our human limitations. Now, Haldane was one of those bigger than life people, amazing person, brilliant scientist. I mean, people use the word genius, etc., to talk about him. He was crazy, but in an endearing sort of way. He did all sorts of scientific experiments on himself and on his family. They ended up with broken eardrums and all sorts of maladies as a result of these experiments. And he was absolutely fearless on the battlefields of the First World War. The other soldiers just couldn't believe it. And so it's a very entertaining biography. This came out a few years ago, a dominant character. People described Haldane as a large woolly rhinoceros. Very funny guy. Okay, so conclusion. Human beings are fallible. We store many half-truths and falsities in our mental warehouses. We can't tell the difference between our true ideas and our errors. They look the same to us. We allow our subconscious biases, hunches, and hatreds, fears, and emotions to decide what is true and what is false. The cure is to adopt a mindset of intellectual humility and also to understand that absolute certainty is a chimera. Montaigne can help. And here he is talking about intellectual humility. The sharper and livelier our wisdom is, the more weaknesses it finds in itself and the more it mistrusts itself. Actually, it just occurred to me that Socrates said something very similar to this, which I won't go into. This also reminds me of a statement by Goethe, with wisdom grows doubt, which is exactly the same idea that Montaigne is talking about here. So, that concludes our discussion of human fallibility, a defining feature of the human condition. Thank you very much for watching.